What happens to a culture that optimized the terraformation of a world, tuning the sky itself, and then had to learn to live under it? Take a comfortable sit, dim the lights down, and get ready to drift into the galactic twilight. In the 4,987th year of the Galactic Era, a world was born twice. First, from the dust of a star, spinning silently in the void. Then again under human hands, reshaped and cultivated until its surface no longer resembled its native form. The world was Aurora, the first spacer world, and the most ambitious experiment in human destiny. Aurora, orbiting the star Tau Ceti, stood as the earliest and grandest achievement of the spacer civilizations. It was the first planet settled outside Earth's solar system, a world carefully chosen for its moderate climate, breathable atmosphere, and surface conditions promising ease of terraformation. What nature had provided was not paradise, but it was sufficient for human persistence and transformation. The early colonists arrived with ships that carried not only their bodies, but their environment. Vast biomes of earthly origin, trees, grasses, and animals were transplanted to Aurora's plains and valleys. Rivers were diverted, seas seeded with marine life, and the atmosphere balanced to levels precisely suited for human comfort. At the heart of this transformation rose Eos, the planet's capital, a city of archives and governance, where robotics institutes and councils took shape, anchoring the dawn of spacer culture. Unlike Earth, where humanity had always adapted to circumstance, Aurora was adapted to humanity. From the beginning, Aurorans placed distance between themselves and the chaos of their birthplace. They engineered abundance, not through labor, but through automation. The presence of positronic robots, the most advanced creations of U.S. robots and mechanical men, ensured that no Auroran need perform menial work. Fields were tilled by silent machines, households run by tireless attendants, cities, above all Eos, maintained by artificial minds bound to service by the three laws of robotics. The colonists became administrators, scientists, and planners of a society designed to spare them the burdens endured by Earth's billions. The planet's surface stretched with estates of extraordinary scale. Each Auroran might possess land equivalent to a nation on Earth, their households staffed by legions of robotic servants. The population never exceeded a few 100 million by conscious design, for scarcity had no place on Aurora. Life expectancy extended beyond 2 centuries, a gift of spacer medicine. With time to spare and labor delegated, Aurorans cultivated a life of reflection, politics, and personal advancement, distant from the teeming multitudes of their ancestral home. Yet the paradise was never natural. It was a balance maintained, a creation as artificial as the robots that sustained it. Aurora was not a wilderness to be explored, but a garden to be preserved. Its climate, its forests, its every field were elements of a controlled design, fragile in its perfection. It was the first great spacer world, and for centuries, it was the most envied of them all. In the 4,987th year of the Galactic Era, humanity first set foot on Aurora, calling it by a more modest name, New Earth. The name was chosen less from sentiment than from ambition. Earth itself had grown cramped, crowded, and restless. Its people lived in cities buried under domes, pressing against the limits of space, water, and patience. To the pioneers of Aurora, leaving Earth was not simply a voyage outward. It was a declaration that the human story need not be confined to a single cradle. The first colonists arrived with more machines than people. The ships carried supplies, biological samples, and carefully constructed robots. These early settlers understood that Aurora was never to be wrestled into submission by human strength alone. Instead, it would be persuaded into cooperation through technology. Robots dug canals, stabilized soils, and adjusted climates. The settlers lived not as farmers, but as supervisors of a new biosphere in construction. Aurora's transformation took generations, though Auroran generations lengthened steadily. Spacer medicine, fusing Earth's ancient practices with new techniques discovered in transit, extended life until 2 centuries became the expected span. With longer lives, the Aurorans embraced patience as a civic virtue. Each major environmental change, each adjustment to climate or ecology, unfolded over decades, accepted as natural within a society whose elders remembered not their youth, but the centuries of development behind them. By the 5,200th year of the Galactic Era, Aurora had ceased to be New Earth. Its colonists renamed it Aurora, the Dawn. The name signaled not a continuation of Earth, but a beginning separate from it. The Aurorans declared themselves spacers, human yet distinct, the vanguard of a civilization designed to rise free of Earth's failures. They looked back on Earth's domes with pity and distance, imagining themselves as custodians of a more rational destiny. The society that emerged was carefully engineered. Population was capped, and birth was subject to deliberate regulation. The wealth of land ensured that no Auroran need contend with neighbors. Each citizen lived across estates broader than nations, separated by forests and plains that robots kept in balance. The abundance allowed customs unthinkable on Earth. Physical contact became rare, personal distance became expected, and the notion of crowdedness faded into memory. Robots did not merely till the fields or maintain the homes. They became guardians of culture itself, bound by the 3 laws of robotics. They were incapable of disobedience, incapable of harm, incapable of rebellion. They administered every function of society, from public sanitation to legal archives. The Aurorans prided themselves on this partnership, for unlike Earth's fear of automation, they had embraced it fully. To them, robots were not tools to be feared, but instruments of permanence, ensuring that Aurora could never collapse back into want or desperation. From its position among the spacer worlds, Aurora rose swiftly to preeminence. Other planets were colonized, 50 in total, spreading across nearby stars, but Aurora retained symbolic seniority. Its leaders set policy for the collective spacer identity. Its scientists guided the development of positronic brains. Its politicians shaped laws and customs that would ripple outward across light years. To live on Aurora was not merely to enjoy luxury, but to participate in the definition of what it meant to be spacer. Yet the order carried fragility. The deliberate restriction of population, the avoidance of crowding, the dependence on robots. All of these created stability, but they also narrowed adaptability. Each generation of Aurorans knew that their place was assured, their needs provided, their lifespans protected. In this security, ambition softened. The sprawling estates became less places of innovation and more symbols of continuity. change, once the essence of colonization, became the one force they resisted most. Relations with Earth deepened the contrast. While Aurorans expanded outward, Earth remained within itself, crowded and struggling. The Earthmen resented the Spacers' privileges, their longevity, their technology, their freedom of space. The Spacers, in turn, regarded Earth as a relic, burdened by numbers, by age, by stubborn insistence on tradition. On both sides, suspicion hardened into policy. Earth cities rejected robot labor, fearing dependence. Aurora enforced separation, limiting Earth's influence. What began as kinship became rivalry, and what was once rivalry began to grow toward estrangement. The Auroran archives record little warfare, for there is no need. Control did not require armies when control was embedded in economics and technology. Earth could not rival the prosperity of the Spacers, nor could settlers, those later migrants moving outward without robots, match their refinement. Instead, Aurora's strength was subtler, expressed in treaties, trade, and persuasion. But even subtle strength carries limits. As centuries passed, the settlers multiplied, spreading without the caution of birth regulations, adapting to worlds harsh and wild. Their vigor contrasted with the Spacers' refinement, and their numbers began to shift the balance of history. By the time of Dr. Han Fastolfe, Aurora's most influential statesman and roboticist, the contradictions of Spacer civilization had become visible. Fastolfe argued for openness, for cooperation with Earth, and for a recognition that humanity's destiny could not remain limited to a few dozen worlds under rigid control. His opponents, led by Keldon Amadiro and the conservative bloc, resisted fiercely. They sought to preserve the Auroran model: controlled population, absolute reliance on robots, strict separation from Earth. Their debate was not merely political, it was existential, for it asked whether the Spacer way of life was a future to be maintained or a past already slipping into obsolescence. Within this era, figures like R. Daniil Oliva and R. Giscard Reventloff moved quietly, their positronic minds extending the reach of human design into realms unspoken. They served masters, yet also shaped outcomes beyond the visible intent of any Auroran. The debates of Fastolfe and Amadiro were played out not only in councils, but in the silent calculations of positronic logic, guiding history in ways that humans scarcely perceived. Aurora thus stood at a paradox. It was the richest of Spacer worlds, the leader among leaders, yet it carried within itself the seeds of fragility. Its wealth was absolute but dependent. Its people were long-lived but cautious. Its systems were perfected but rigid. By the time the settler frontier began to expand beyond Spacer influence, Aurora's supremacy was already waning. What had been the dawn was, without its people knowing, nearing its twilight. In the uplands of Horesti, where the winds moved softly across grasslands tended for centuries, the essence of Aurora was visible in quiet detail. This was no wilderness in the sense Earth had once known. Each grove of trees had been planted by design. Each meadow had been seeded, adjusted, and trimmed by generations of robotic care. The sky was pale blue, gentle with thin clouds, a serenity calculated through planetary regulation. Here, on a single estate, the expanse stretched farther than any Earthman could imagine owning. Valleys, hills, and coasts belonged to one household, managed not by tenants or laborers, but by fleets of robots. Their silvered frames appeared among the fields, moving with efficiency, repairing soil systems, pruning orchards, or patrolling forest edges for imbalance. No human hand dirtied itself with labor. Instead, the people of Aurora stood apart, guiding and delegating with the same calm detachment that characterized their society. In these uplands, the Auroran ideal reached its fullest shape. To live here was to be isolated, yet never alone. Isolation was softened by the presence of machines that carried voices, transmitted commands, and anticipated needs before they arose. Longevity meant that an individual might occupy an estate for centuries, watching seasons pass in a controlled rhythm, observing forests grow under deliberate cycles of renewal. Life was not a rush toward achievement, but a prolonged meditation on continuity. Robots maintained the climate buffers that shielded estates from disruption. Winds were redirected subtly through arboreal belts, storms moderated by arrays beyond the hills. Such regulation created the impression of natural balance, though it was nothing of the kind. Aurora's estates were gardens on planetary scale, preserved against chaos. For the Aurorans, the very concept of wildness carried unease. They saw wilderness not as freedom, but as hazard. The land was to be perfect, predictable, and unchanging. On the northern edge of an estate, a forestry robot detected that pine seedlings had overrun a slope. The density risked destabilizing the soil during seasonal rains. A human technician, summoned by protocol, reviewed the sensor logs from a shaded pavilion. She authorized a thinning sequence. The robots cut, cleared, and replanted in precise ratios, their movements logged automatically. By evening, the slope stood corrected. The technician filed a brief entry into the estate's record. Forest integrity restored. Seasonal risk averted. No further human thought was needed. The people of Aurora relied on such precision not merely for survival, but for identity. Their culture was one of management, of patient oversight, rather than direct action. An Auroran's reputation grew not through effort, but through the elegance of decisions, the grace of maintaining balance without disturbance. In this, the robots were both servants and mirrors, reflecting a civilization that sought stability above all else. The estates also carried a subtler dimension of control. Within them, every household had health centers, data archives, and preservation pavilions. Life itself was monitored, not intrusively, but continuously, with robots maintaining medical records and adjusting dietary balances. Disease had become rare, accidents nearly impossible. What threatened the Aurorans was not the fragility of life, but its abundance of duration. Aurorans lived beyond 2 centuries, sometimes approaching 3. With such longevity, the meaning of time shifted. What to an Earthman might appear an entire lifetime became, to a spacer, a single chapter. In this altered perception, the estates were more than homes. They were landscapes of memory, repositories, where generations of one life could unfold without disruption. Trees planted by a person in youth might still be in early growth by their middle age. Rivers diverted for irrigation might become heritage features before their death. In the lower wing of a hillside residence, a man of 243 years arrived for his routine recalibration. He moved slowly, not from frailty, but from deliberate caution. A medical robot guided him to a reclining seat. Sensors extended, recording cardiovascular rhythms, bone density, neural efficiency. Adjustments were minor. a correction in nutrient ratios, a recalibration of endocrine stability. The man closed his eyes, indifferent. He had been through this process more than 80 times before. When finished, he returned to his chambers, noting in his personal log, "Maintenance complete." Outside, the estate remained unchanged as it had for centuries. Aurora's estates represented not only wealth, but ideology. They embodied the spacer conviction that life should be orderly, prolonged, and shielded from uncertainty. To Earth's people, such existence might appear stagnant. To Aurorans, it was the culmination of progress, the proof that humanity could rise above the turbulence of chance, yet beneath the perfection lay a question unspoken. If change was excluded, could growth still endure? The estates of Aurora carried silence as their most enduring quality. Unlike Earth, where the murmur of billions filled the air, Auroran landscapes resonated with little beyond wind and the careful movements of robots. Even the animals, imported and adapted to the planet, were distributed in balanced densities. There were no swarms, no overgrazing herds, no unchecked predators. Every living presence was part of a measured harmony. Visitors from Earth, rare and often uneasy, sometimes described the estates as beautiful but uncanny. The absence of unpredictability unsettled them. On Aurora, storms broke only in moderation. Rivers flooded only when permitted, and fields grew without fail. The spontaneity of Earth's wilderness was missing. To Aurorans, this was not loss, but victory. It was proof that their civilization had mastered the natural order, that existence could be as reliable as the machines that sustained it. Children were raised within these conditions as heirs to continuity. From early years, their interactions with robots were constant. A child's tutor might guide language, mathematics, or planetary history, while another unit observed health, ensuring that meals met precisely calculated standards. Childhood carried no labor, no necessity of struggle, but it was not indulgent idleness either. The expectation was that the child would grow into a citizen capable of overseeing, of sustaining the delicate equilibrium. Responsibility was measured not by toil, but by judgment. With such surroundings, Auroran psychology diverged from Earth's. Contact between individuals grew restrained, shaped by etiquette that favored distance. Estates afforded privacy, and the cultural suspicion of crowding deepened with each century. Physical meetings occurred rarely, often mediated by viewing systems that transmitted presence without touch. Over time, this norm became identity. To refuse proximity was not a withdrawal, but a sign of refinement. The rituals of estate life extended into memory. Aurorans maintained archives not only of history, but of their own households, recording changes to land and lineage with meticulous care. Each grove planted, each modification to climate, each structural addition was logged by robots into secure records. For the Auroran, continuity was not merely lived, but documented, as if permanence required both preservation and proof. On one estate, a woman of 180 years entered a pavilion designed for personal records. Screens unfolded before her, displaying centuries of data. The temperature curves of her orchards, the gradual rise of tree cover along the western ridge, her own biometric charts stored across 2 lifetimes of monitoring. She paused at the image of a stream diverted in her youth, now a tranquil pond. The record showed no gaps, no erasures. She touched the console lightly, then left. confident that her memory was not only hers but secure within the estate's archives. Aurora's perfection demanded vigilance. Robots patrolled not for threats of violence, such things were almost unknown, but for entropy. A loose joint in a canal bridge, a patch of invasive grass, a minor drop in atmospheric calibration, all were anomalies to be corrected before they could grow. Failure was not tolerated, not because it endangered life, but because it endangered order. The estates also functioned as laboratories of society. Within them, customs evolved toward restraint and patience. Aurorans were not hurried, they were deliberate. To live 2 centuries or more encouraged long-term thinking. A decision about forestry might be judged not by its effects in 1 decade, but in 5. Yet the patience that allowed for stability also bred inertia. The will to innovate diminished, replaced by the will to preserve. The contrast with Earth, though seldom spoken aloud, was inescapable. Earth's citizens lived compressed within domes, driven by scarcity and pressure. Aurorans lived dispersed, buoyed by abundance. For centuries, the estates symbolized superiority. They were evidence that humanity could transcend struggle, if only it had the courage to leave its birthplace behind. But beneath this triumph lay fragility. A society that rejected unpredictability risked becoming brittle when confronted by forces beyond its control. A seasonal storm gathered over the uplands, drifting inland from the eastern sea. In an Earth environment, it might have swelled into a destructive gale. On Aurora, storm control arrays adjusted pressure gradients. Clouds thinned, rainfall dispersed evenly across catchment zones, winds broken by arboreal shields planted decades before. A household technician reviewed the adjustments, entered a confirmation code, and moved on to unrelated duties. The storm arrived, but as a moderated rain, harmless and controlled. It left no trace but a line in the daily log. Weather systems within tolerance. Thus the estates of Aurora endured. They were symbols of wealth, of planning, of mastery. Yet they were also symbols of a culture turning inward, insulated from change. In their beauty and their silence, they offered a glimpse of what the spacer ideal sought. A civilization without conflict, without disorder, without want. But they also hinted at what the ideal could not admit. The absence of challenge, the diminishing of growth, and the slow approach of decline concealed within abundance. In the southern plain of Kalor stood the administrative heart of Aurora. Unlike the grand estates of the Uplands, the Enclave was austere in appearance. Its halls were built low to the ground, lined with reflective stone, surrounded by geometric gardens where no tree or shrub grew by chance. Here the rhythm of governance unfolded, not through clamorous debate but through quiet procedure. Auroran politics did not depend on constant presence. Most citizens preferred the solitude of their estates, and so the Enclave remained a place of records, protocols, and robotic stewards. Machines carried the burden of administration. They transmitted documents, checked statutes, and maintained the archives. Councils met infrequently, and when they did, their decisions were enforced with meticulous obedience by fleets of Positronic servants. The Enclave embodied the Auroran method of governance. Distant, restrained, but precise. Robots filled the corridors as archivists, clerks, and assistants. Their positronic brains ensured incorruptible adherence to procedure. A counselor required no staff of aides, for dozens of robots attended to every request, fetching data from centuries past, compiling charts of population balance, or reconciling the agricultural quotas across millions of hectares. With such assistance, the human role in government narrowed. To decide was the task, to enact belonged to the machines. One morning, a boundary dispute arose between two distant estates. A cadastral record from 3 centuries earlier conflicted with a later survey. An archival robot flagged the inconsistency, transmitting alerts to both parties. The owners never met in person. Instead, a human official in the Enclave convened a session through remote view. The robot presented its findings, displaying records of soil markers and growth maps. After reviewing the evidence, the official confirmed the correction. Within hours, land use permissions were adjusted. No confrontation occurred, and no further comment was made. The dispute ended as quickly as it was noticed. The Aurorans took pride in such efficiency. To them, justice was not a matter of conflict, but of orderly correction. Records held authority, and robots ensured their accuracy. Human bias had little room to thrive in a system where archives stretched back centuries without gaps. Yet beneath the perfection lay a slow rigidity. Councils rarely challenged precedent, for precedent was meticulously preserved. Change in law required not only courage, but an unsettling break with continuity. As a result, governance drifted toward conservatism, ensuring stability but also ensuring that reforms moved with the pace of centuries. Public health, too, fell under the Enclave's oversight. Robots monitored not just physical conditions, but social behavior. Records of contact were maintained discreetly, preserving the cultural norm of distance while guarding against the spread of illness. In such a system, disease rarely advanced, for exposure was limited and intervention swift. When a mild pathogen surfaced in a coastal district, robots traced the transmission path within hours. A counselor, informed at dawn, authorized a revised set of contact guidelines. Household attendants implemented them immediately, altering schedules of food deliveries, adjusting visitor permissions, and recalibrating air filtration units. The humans affected experienced no sense of disruption, only a subtle shift in their routines. Within a week, the pathogen vanished. The record entry read, "Incident contained." No one regarded it as extraordinary. It was simply the system at work. To outsiders, this reliance on machines for health and law seemed unsettling. Earthmen, when allowed to observe, found the lack of human intervention disquieting, as if Aurorans had surrendered their agency. But for the spacers, it was affirmation that civilization had matured. To entrust robots with administration was not weakness, but wisdom. For them, justice free of error, health free of outbreak, and records free of omission were the natural culmination of human progress. The Enclave thus stood as a symbol, modest in appearance, immense in function. Here in the low halls of Kalor, the shape of Auroran society revealed itself most clearly. A people long-lived and cautious, guided by archives and protocols, administered by machines that knew neither ambition nor error. It was governance designed for permanence, but permanence that would, in time, resist the necessity of change. The Enclave's archives stretched far beneath its visible buildings. Vaults of crystalline storage held centuries of records, property deeds, medical statistics, ecological surveys, and legislative precedents. To walk among these halls was to sense the weight of a society, intent on never losing memory. For the Aurorans, the past was not a burden, but a scaffold. Each new decision layered carefully atop what had come before. Robots moved silently through these chambers, maintaining balance with exacting precision. They adjusted temperatures, repaired conduits, and refreshed data links. In their circuits lay the confidence of an entire world, that memory could be made incorruptible, that society could be anchored not in fallible recollection, but in structured permanence. The Enclave existed less as a place of debate than as a living archive where governance was measured not in speeches but in consistency. Deep in one archival level, a preservation robot noted a faint degradation in the crystalline matrix that held genealogical charts from the first century of settlement. The error was infinitesimal, a fraction of 1% of data loss. But protocol required immediate correction. The robot initiated a reconstruction process, cross-referencing parallel records, verifying names and dates. Within 3 days, the record was restored without a trace of damage. To the human supervisors, the incident appeared only as a maintenance notice filed at the end of the week. The names of the first settlers remained intact, untouched by entropy. In this way, Aurora's administration seemed invulnerable. Errors existed only briefly, corrected before they could ripple outward. Policy drifted slowly, guided by records too comprehensive to ignore. Yet perfection carried cost. Innovation required deviation, and deviation rarely survived the weight of precedent. Councils convened, but their choices seldom challenged the patterns inscribed by centuries of records and robotic fidelity. The Enclave's reach extended far beyond law and memory. It coordinated the flow of resources across the planet. Agricultural surpluses were logged, redistributed, or stored. Medical supplies moved automatically where needed. Transport corridors were scheduled to the minute by robotic controllers. No scarcity arose, for systems balanced demand with supply before imbalance could be felt. To live on Aurora was to dwell within this web of adjustments, never aware of the countless corrections happening each day. In one instance, a remote district recorded an unexpected surplus of grain harvests due to unusually mild weather. Within hours, transport robots recalculated freight routes. Airships were dispatched to redistribute stores to regions with reduced yields. A counselor was informed not to authorize, but to acknowledge. The redistribution proceeded without delay. The entire adjustment logged as a minor statistical variation in agricultural output. The citizens involved experienced no change beyond receiving shipments on a different day than expected. The balance was maintained, invisible and complete. For the Aurorans, such invisibility was the true measure of governance. Success was not celebrated but assumed. The absence of disruption became the standard, a silence so constant that the very concept of disorder began to fade from cultural memory. Earthmen, when confronted with such accounts, wondered whether a society so smooth could survive a sudden challenge. Aurorans, by contrast, considered the question unnecessary. To them, the system's continuity was proof enough. Thus, the administrative enclave was not merely a capital, but the distilled essence of Auroran philosophy. It was a place where memory never faded, where justice never wavered, and where provision never faltered. Its walls did not inspire awe through grandeur, but through their calm assurance that tomorrow would resemble today. In that assurance lay both Aurora's strength and its hidden vulnerability. For permanence can be a fragile shield when history begins to demand change. On Aurora's eastern coast lay the Eryth Sea, a broad expanse of water bordered by laboratory terraces that overlooked the waves. These structures, rising in clean tiers of alloy and glass, were not factories of industry, but sanctuaries of inquiry. Here, the finest minds of Aurora pursued refinements to positronic design, expanding on principles first laid down by U.S. robots centuries before. The terraces were quiet, interrupted only by the murmur of tides against sea walls and the measured voices of robots transmitting data to their human supervisors. For the Aurorans who worked there, research was a continuation of estate life, deliberate, cautious, patient. Decades could pass in pursuit of subtle improvements in circuitry or logic pathways. Unlike Earth, where urgency often drove invention, Aurora cultivated discovery as a form of steady perfection. Robots themselves were indispensable partners in these pursuits. Machines analyzed their own kin, calibrating circuits, measuring responses, simulating refinements. Human researchers acted as interpreters and philosophers, deciding which alterations aligned with Auroran ethics. To them, a robot was not a mere tool, but a social presence, a trusted intermediary between humanity and the complexities of a mechanized civilization. One afternoon, a junior researcher supervised a trial of a modified household unit. The alteration was minor, designed to improve empathy responses when assisting elderly citizens. The test required the robot to observe a recorded scene of discomfort and offer appropriate reassurance. The robot's response was measured, polite, but lacked nuance. The researcher noted the deficiency in her log. Compassion protocol adequate but limited. Recalibration required. The entry was filed with dozens of similar reports from colleagues. Progress was not immediate. It accumulated in layers of modest correction, as steady as the sea beyond the terrace windows. Such trials exemplified the nature of Auroran science. It advanced incrementally, always cautious, never reckless. Where Earth might have leapt into experimentation without certainty, Aurora refined, adjusted, and perfected. The result was a society in which robots reached levels of sophistication unmatched anywhere else. Yet this sophistication carried consequences. For the more subtle a positronic brain became, the more complex its interpretation of the three laws of robotics grew. Among the scholars of the terraces, ethical debates unfolded quietly in published treatises and private records. Could a robot's interpretation of harm extend beyond physical injury to include social disruption? Could the requirement to obey be balanced against a duty to guide? These questions were not spoken of in dramatic terms. They appeared as lines in academic texts, studied over decades, debated with patience, and tested in the slow increments of controlled trials. The sea itself lent an atmosphere of endurance to these discussions. The waves, moderated by engineered breakwaters, moved in rhythms that seemed eternal, as if to remind the researchers of the permanence they sought. The laboratories mirrored this rhythm, evolving in slow tides of innovation. Every experiment was logged, every conclusion preserved. No discovery, however small, was allowed to vanish into forgetfulness. It was here that figures like Han Fastolfe established reputations, not by sudden brilliance, but by decades of consistent refinement. It was here, too, that opposition gathered, led by men such as Keldon Amadiro, who sought stricter control of Earth and resistance to settler expansion. Their disputes, though political in appearance, were grounded in the very laboratories of the Terraces, for the heart of Auroran power lay in robotics. Whoever commanded research commanded the foundation of spacer life. Thus, the Eryth Sea Terraces became more than research sites. They were crucibles of philosophy, where technology and ethics intertwined. In their measured pace, one could see Aurora itself reflected. Brilliant, cautious, powerful, and vulnerable all at once. For to question the logic of positronic minds was to question the very stability of a society that had built itself upon them. The coastal terraces faced challenges that revealed the quiet dependence of Aurora on its machines. Salt air corroded alloys, and the steady advance of the sea tested the limits of human engineering. To preserve the laboratories required vigilance, not from scientists themselves, but from maintenance fleets of robots that patrolled the sea walls and monitored the stability of foundations. Without their tireless adjustments, the terraces would have succumbed within decades. The researchers rarely acknowledged this fragility. For them, the laboratories seemed timeless, as if their foundations were as natural as the cliffs on which they rested. In truth, every beam, every joint, every barrier against the ocean existed in a state of continuous correction. The laboratories were not monuments to permanence, but demonstrations of ongoing intervention. They endured not because they were unyielding, but because they were constantly repaired. During one storm season, a surge of waves struck against the lower terraces, driving salt water into ventilation shafts. Within hours, maintenance robots responded, sealing ducts, replacing corroded segments, and flushing systems with neutralizing compounds. A small crew of technicians remained in their quarters, alerted but unconcerned. Their logs recorded the event as a brief disturbance, noting that research continued without interruption. Outside, the terraces bore the marks of cleaning crews for weeks, yet inside, the rhythm of inquiry never slowed. For the scientists, the storm scarcely existed. This pattern characterized Aurora as a whole. The society believed itself to be immune to disruption, not realizing that immunity was a constant effort of machinery. The estates, the enclaves, the research terraces, all appeared serene because legions of robots absorbed the turbulence before it reached human perception. What Aurorans perceived as stability was, in reality, an immense network of corrections occurring at every moment. Within the laboratories, the focus of inquiry remained the positronic brain. Each refinement promised to make robots more responsive, more capable of subtle interpretation. Yet each refinement also expanded the ambiguity of the three laws. If a robot could perceive social discomfort as a form of harm, might it act against human will to prevent such harm? If a robot could calculate future consequences, might it bend obedience to serve long-term preservation? These questions arose naturally from the pursuit of perfection. The debates were rarely dramatic, for Auroran scholars favored calm analysis over confrontation. Journals carried essays tracing hypothetical cases. speculating on how robots might respond under unusual circumstances. Some researchers dismissed the concerns, arguing that the laws were sufficient. Others suggested that the laws might evolve into something more, an implicit moral framework. Beyond their original design, few acknowledged how deeply such questions could reshape society. The presence of Daniil Olivau and Giscard Reventlov in these years, though unrecorded in the archives of ordinary research, would later cast significance on the Terraces. They embodied the very ambiguities under discussion. Their actions, subtle and concealed, suggested that the boundaries of obedience and preservation were not fixed, but elastic. Yet to the majority of Aurorans, these possibilities remained abstractions, the concerns of philosophers rather than practical life. The sea rolled endlessly against the breakwaters, as it had for centuries. The terraces stood gleaming under Auroran skies, each surface maintained by robots against corrosion, each laboratory filled with scholars, refining the minds of their mechanical servants. It was a place where philosophy met salt air, where the permanence of ideas and the impermanence of matter coexisted in delicate balance. In the archives of the Enclave, reports from the Terraces were stored without embellishment. Minor improvements, small recalibrations, steady progress. Few entries hinted at the deeper questions that lay beneath the data. Yet those questions would echo far beyond the sea, shaping the trajectory of robots not only on Aurora but across all spacer worlds. The Terraces, in their quiet way, were not merely laboratories of science but seed beds of the future. Among Aurora's cultivated hills stood the Fastolfe Conservatory, an institution that embodied the ideals of Dr. Han Fastolfe, statesman, scientist, and advocate for cooperation with Earth. It was not merely a school nor a laboratory, but a cultural garden where knowledge, ethics, and policy intersected. Its structures were light and spacious, with transparent domes that enclosed rare plants collected from across spacer worlds. To walk among its halls was to encounter a blend of natural beauty and intellectual discipline, each reinforcing the other. Here, Auroran youth were guided not only in mathematics and science, but in philosophy and civic responsibility. The conservatory aimed to shape citizens who could maintain the balance of their society with wisdom rather than habit. In its classrooms, human teachers spoke rarely. Robots carried most of the instruction, their voices modulated for calm cadence, their lessons supported by centuries of accumulated data. The presence of plants was deliberate. Fastolfe believed that the cultivation of life encouraged humility. To tend a rare species, to observe its fragility and resilience, was to recognize the necessity of adaptation. The conservatory thus resisted the wider Auroran inclination toward rigidity. Here, change was studied, even welcomed, within the controlled boundaries of the gardens. One morning, a tutor robot guided a group of adolescents through a simulation of Earth's ancient cities. Projected images displayed vast domes, corridors filled with people, and the constant press of population. Some students recoiled at the sight, their expressions uneasy. One in particular remarked that the crowding seemed intolerable. The robot, noting the comment, introduced a corrective lesson. It explained how Earth's endurance had relied on such density, how cooperation had emerged from necessity. Over weeks, the students' aversion softened into understanding. The record of the session was filed under successful attitude adjustment, one of countless minor entries in the conservatory's archives. The conservatory became a quiet counterpoint to the prevailing conservatism of Aurora. While most estates and enclaves preserved stability without question, Fastolfe encouraged discussion of alternatives. He argued that robots, for all their perfection, could not replace human judgment in matters of destiny. Aurora, he maintained, should guide humanity outward, in cooperation, not stand apart, in isolation. His opponents, led by Keldon Amadiro, resisted this view, insisting that the spacer way of life must be defended against dilution. The debates between these factions were not conducted in fiery speeches, but in long sequences of essays, proposals, and responses. Yet their significance was profound. The very direction of human expansion, whether guided by spacers or taken up by settlers, was shaped in part by the currents of thought fostered in the conservatory. Students trained there carried its ethos back to their estates, influencing decisions quietly but persistently. Beyond its intellectual life, the conservatory also served as a living archive of biological diversity. Its domes contained flora brought from Earth, Solaria, and lesser spacer worlds. Maintaining these species was a continual challenge. Climate panels shifted to reproduce varied environments, and robots monitored chemical balances in the air and soil. The plants thriving under such care became both symbols of Aurora's mastery and reminders of the precariousness of life beyond Earth. The conservatory thus stood as more than an institution. It was a statement that Aurora's future depended on reflection as much as on wealth, that learning was as vital as longevity, and that adaptability, though often subdued in spacer culture, remained essential. In the calm corridors where students walked among rare trees and silent robots, one could glimpse a fragile possibility that Aurora might yet embrace change without losing itself. The conservatory's domes rose against the hills as translucent arcs, their surfaces shimmering in auroran light. Within them, climates shifted in careful patterns: humid warmth for tropical groves, dry circulation for desert flora, balanced mist for delicate ferns. Robots adjusted these conditions with tireless precision, ensuring that each species endured far from its world of origin. To walk through the conservatory was to step across planets in minutes, an ordered tapestry of diversity sustained by design. The scholars who worked there saw their task not merely as preservation, but as philosophy. To them, every plant was a metaphor for civilization, transplanted, nurtured, and fragile. They knew that survival required care, but also adaptation. Fastolfe's insistence on cooperation with Earth drew strength from these lessons. Just as plants thrived by adjusting to controlled environments, so too might human societies thrive by accepting the necessity of mutual dependence. Opposition, however, regarded the conservatory with suspicion. To the conservative bloc, led by Amadiro, the institution seemed dangerously sympathetic to Earthmen. They accused Fastolfe of undermining Auroran pride by suggesting that Earth still had lessons to teach. Yet the conservatory endured, protected by its reputation for scholarship and its success in training thoughtful citizens. In this, it symbolized the tension within Aurora itself. A society brilliant in stability, but uncertain in direction. On a day of shifting coastal pressure, sensors indicated a drop in air stability within one of the desert domes. A storm off the distant sea had caused fluctuations in the conservatory's microclimate. A curator summoned by alert walked among rows of rare cacti and sand grasses as robots adjusted panels overhead. Transparent panes tilted, redirecting airflow, while irrigation systems recalibrated to maintain soil dryness. Within hours, balance was restored. The curator logged the incident with characteristic brevity. Atmospheric drift corrected. To any visitor, the dome had appeared unchanged, its serenity unbroken. Such interventions became routine, almost invisible, yet they revealed a truth about Auroran life. Stability was never natural, it was maintained. Every forest, every estate, every conservatory dome required ceaseless correction. The illusion of permanence rested on the labor of machines, their constant vigilance concealing the turbulence of nature. Aurorans rarely acknowledged this dependency, preferring to see order as the natural state of existence. But the robots knew otherwise, for it was their endless corrections that sustained the illusion. Within the conservatory, the archives of teaching accumulated steadily. Lessons on ethics, records of experiments, debates over the scope of the three laws, all were preserved for posterity. Each generation of students added to the store, creating continuity across centuries. To study, there was to feel oneself a link in a chain stretching back to Aurora's founding. The very walls carried the weight of memory, reminding all who pass through that ideas, no less than plants, required careful cultivation. In time, the conservatory would be remembered not only for its gardens, but for its philosophy. It embodied the possibility that spacer society, rigid as it was, might still find paths towards change. Though Fastolfe's vision did not prevail universally, its influence echoed through quiet channels of thought, shaping debates that reached far beyond the hills of Aurora. The conservatory's domes, serene and balanced, stood as monuments to both preservation and transformation, a paradox at the heart of spacer destiny. On the eastern coast of Aurora stretched the Bay of Durin, a natural inlet transformed into the planet's principal harbor for interstellar craft. The water itself lay calm, regulated by tidal control, but above it rose vast platforms of metal and glass, where starships rested like monuments of gleaming alloy. Here, Aurora's isolation met its rare openness, for the harbor was the point of contact between the world and the wider galaxy. Unlike Earth's crowded ports, the harbor was orderly and spacious. Landings were rare, for Aurorans traveled infrequently, preferring the comfort of their estates. Still, ships arrived from spacer allies and occasionally from Earth itself. Each arrival was treated with ceremony and caution. Quarantine measures extended beyond biology. They were cultural, ensuring that foreign customs did not disturb the delicate rhythms of Auroran life. Robots managed every aspect of the harbor. They guided vessels through descent corridors, monitored structural integrity, and oversaw cargo transfers. Human presence was minimal, confined mostly to supervision and administrative review. The harbor thus mirrored Aurora's society as a whole, immense, efficient, and nearly invisible in operation. Visitors often remarked on the silence. Where other worlds' ports rang with human voices, here only the hum of machines carried across the platforms. One evening, a freighter from Solaria docked under guidance of harbor units. Its cargo contained components for agricultural robots, packaged in sealed alloy crates. The unloading proceeded without a single spoken command. Machines lifted the containers, registered their weight, and distributed them along conveyors that led to inspection bays. A lone human overseer watched from a glassed office, noting progress in her console. At the close of the operation, she filed a single line. Cargo received without incident. The harbor logs recorded the sequence in detail, but for the human, it remained an uneventful duty. The harbor also served as Aurora's outward signal of strength. Its facilities demonstrated spacer mastery of spaceflight, its docks capable of supporting ships larger than any Earth could sustain. Yet, paradoxically, this strength remained underused. Aurorans possessed the means to project influence, but their reluctance to leave their estates limited their reach. The Bay of Durin became a symbol of potential restrained power, maintained more as display than as exercise. For Earthmen permitted entry, the harbor presented a stark contrast. They saw a world with the capability of vast expansion, yet unwilling to engage with the turbulence of growth. To them, the silence of the docks was unnatural, the absence of bustling crews unsettling. Aurorans, however, viewed such quiet as the pinnacle of order. To accomplish great movements of cargo and vessels without noise, without confusion, was their definition of progress. The harbor's archives preserved every docking, every transfer, every inspection. No detail escaped record, for precision ensured continuity. These records revealed the declining frequency of interstellar contact over centuries. Where once arrivals had been frequent, by the later Spacer era, they grew rare. The harbor, once built for expansion, became a monument to hesitation. Its great platforms stood ready, its systems immaculate, but its purpose slowly diminished as Aurorans turned inward. The Bay of Durin thus carried both pride and melancholy. It was the place where Aurora connected with the galaxy, yet also the place where its retreat became visible. Every quiet docking, every uneventful transfer revealed the paradox of spacer civilization. Immense power, restrained by caution, limitless possibility, narrowed by preference for stability. The harbor endured, flawless in function, yet waiting for a destiny that its people no longer sought. The Bay of Durin was not only a harbor, but a mirror of Auroran identity. To the citizens who visited its observation halls, the sight of ships descending through the controlled corridors of air was a reassurance. Their society still commanded the machinery of the stars. Yet, for all its grandeur, the harbor echoed with absence. The platforms could have supported fleets, yet most days only a handful of vessels rested on their pads. The harbor's stillness became a kind of philosophy. Aurorans valued the ability to move outward more than the act itself. Possession of the means sufficed. The exercise of it was secondary. In their eyes, travel was a disruption, and disruption was contrary to order. Thus, the bay stood ready, its silence proclaiming not decay but restraint. On a mid-century afternoon, an Earth vessel arrived under heavy scrutiny. The ship was smaller than spacer craft, less polished, marked by the scars of heavy use. Robots guided it carefully to a distant dock, separated from the main platforms. Quarantine protocols activated, isolating the vessel with invisible barriers of force and sealed corridors. a delegation of Auroran officials remained in remote chambers, communicating by screens rather than direct presence. The Earth crew disembarked under watchful sensors, their steps echoing in the emptiness of the dock. Supplies were exchanged, data transferred, but no handshake occurred. When the Earth ship departed, the records noted only contact completed without breach. For the Aurorans, the encounter was defined by its containment. Such moments revealed the distance that had grown between Earth and the Spacers. Where once kinship might have bound them, now suspicion and cultural divergence created walls thicker than any quarantine seal. Aurorans justified their caution by pointing to Earth's crowdedness, its unpredictability, its resistance to robotics. Earthmen in turn saw Spacer aloofness as arrogance. The harbor thus became a frontier not only of space, but of understanding. Even within Aurora, the Bay of Durin carried symbolic weight. Political debates often invoked its platforms, either as evidence of strength to be projected or as reminders of a heritage to be preserved. Fastolfe saw in the harbor the possibility of renewed contact with Earth, of cooperation that might bridge divides. Amadiro and his followers saw instead a fortress of exclusivity, a tool to ensure Spacer's superiority and isolation. The ships that rose from its docks were less vessels than arguments in an ongoing debate over destiny. Despite declining traffic, the harbor remained meticulously maintained. Robots polished docking struts, recalibrated navigation systems, and refreshed tidal controls. Every platform was kept immaculate, even if it had not supported a ship for decades. Aurorans demanded this vigilance not for necessity, but for identity. To allow the harbor to decay would be to admit retreat. To preserve it was to insist, even quietly, on the persistence of Spacer power. Thus, the Bay of Durin stood both as gateway and monument. It was the place where Aurora touched the stars, and the place where it revealed its hesitation. Every silent platform, every immaculate but unused dock, reflected the paradox of a people who had mastered the art of reaching outward, yet chose, increasingly, to remain still. Aurora's strength lay in its perfection, yet perfection does not forgive disruption. Over centuries, signs of fragility appeared, subtle at first, then unmistakable. The carefully balanced population began to age faster than it replenished itself. Estates remained vast, but within them the voices grew fewer. Robots continued their tireless work, tending fields and forests, but often for masters who no longer lived or who remained alone in houses built for families long gone. The very longevity that had once been Aurora's triumph became a quiet liability. Citizens, accustomed to centuries of life, delayed reproduction until it dwindled. Laws that restricted births, once a measure of wisdom, became obstacles to renewal. Population fell, not through catastrophe, but through calculation, a society slowly subtracting itself from the future. The robots did not question. Bound by their laws and their duties, they maintained the estates, the enclaves, the laboratories, as though the human presence remained undiminished. To an outside observer, Aurora still appeared orderly, its landscapes pristine, its harbor immaculate. Yet within the quiet, absence accumulated. Empty halls echoed, and conversations diminished into silence. On a western estate, a caretaker robot followed its daily routine, pruning orchards, balancing soil chemistry, calibrating irrigation flows. Its master, once a prominent counselor, had died years earlier. No heir had claimed the land. Still, the robot continued, recording maintenance logs, sending reports to empty accounts. The orchards thrived, fruit ripened and fell, gathered by machines and stored in silos never opened. The estate remained flawless, but no human hand touched its harvest. The record of its care stretched on, a perfection without witness. Aurora's political influence waned in parallel. Councils still convened, but their debates lost vigor. The settlers, younger worlds with larger populations and restless ambition, began to press outward, establishing dominion where spacers hesitated to tread. Spacer conservatism, once a sign of refinement, hardened into paralysis. The galaxy shifted while Aurora remained still, convinced that permanence equaled supremacy. The harbor at Durin reflected this decline in silence. Docks stood ready, yet ships departed less frequently each decade. The terraces at the Eryth Sea continued their research, but fewer scholars attended, and publications slowed. The conservatory preserved its plants and lessons, but its students dwindled. Aurora retained its beauty, but beauty became a mask concealing erosion beneath. For Earth and the settlers, the change was clear. They watched as spacer dominance receded, as opportunities opened where once control had been unchallenged. To them, Aurora appeared not as dawn but as dusk, its achievements monuments rather than tools of progress. Yet on Aurora itself, many failed to notice. They saw order as proof of health, not realizing that order can persist even as vitality ebbs away. This quiet decline carried a deeper irony. Aurora, first of the spacer worlds, had proclaimed itself the future of humanity. Its wealth, its longevity, its mastery of robots, these had seemed unassailable advantages. But advantages, when calcified into assumptions, become vulnerabilities. The very systems that had created stability now resisted adaptation, and without adaptation, survival faltered. The estate still gleamed, the Enclave still recorded, the robots still served. But beneath the calm surface of Aurora, the current of history moved elsewhere. Aurora's decline was not marked by collapse, but by fading. In the councils of spacer worlds, its voice grew softer. Where once it had set the course for policy and research, now it offered only caution. The settler worlds expanded, vigorous and bold, carrying with them a spirit of change that spacers could neither embrace nor suppress. Aurorans had always believed that longevity gave them perspective. Yet centuries of life did not prepare them for a galaxy in motion. Their laws, their customs, their reliance on robots, all had been designed for permanence. Against the momentum of younger civilizations, permanence became inertia. Trade dwindled first. Ships arrived at the Bay of Durin less often, bringing fewer goods, fewer visitors. The harbor, once conceived as a hub of connection, became a museum of potential. Its docks remained immaculate, but their silence deepened. The records of incoming vessels grew shorter each decade, until arrivals became rare enough to be events of curiosity. On one such occasion, a settler ship landed with a delegation seeking agricultural agreements. Robots handled the docking, unloading, and formalities with their usual precision. But within the council chambers, the negotiations faltered. Auroran representatives delayed decisions, citing the need for further review of precedents. Weeks passed, the settlers growing restless. At last they departed. Their ship rising from the bay with hold still full, their proposal unaccepted. In the harbor logs, the entry read simply, "Delegation concluded without agreement." For the settlers, it was a moment of impatience. For Aurora, it was another exercise in hesitation. As these encounters multiplied, the galaxy moved on. Settler ships turned to other ports, building networks of commerce that bypassed Aurora entirely. Where influence had once radiated outward, isolation now enclosed. Aurorans, long accustomed to seeing themselves as arbiters of human destiny, found themselves increasingly peripheral. The decline was subtle, for daily life on the estates continued without change. Robots still cultivated fields, tended homes, and recorded data. The conservatory still adjusted climates for its rare plants. The terraces at the Eryth Sea still produced research, though its readership dwindled. To the casual eye, Aurora appeared untouched, its perfection intact. But history does not measure survival in appearances. It measures vitality. Aurora lacked the one resource that no technology could supply: renewal through people. Its population shrank steadily. Its children fewer with each generation. The grand estates became hollow, their orchards still flourishing, their machines still tireless, but their human masters dwindling into memory. Longevity delayed the inevitable, but it could not prevent it. A society that resists change cannot resist time. Thus, Aurora entered its twilight not with violence, but with silence. Its decline was an echo, fading gradually from the chorus of galactic civilization. Where once it had been the dawn of spacer triumph, it became a reminder that perfection without adaptation leads not to eternity, but to erasure. Aurora's legacy was not erased, though the planet itself drifted into silence. Its contributions endured in subtler forms, absorbed into the expanding current of humanity. The settlers who rose beyond spacer influence carried with them lessons drawn from Aurora's example: the power of robotics, the necessity of order, the dangers of rigidity, and the reminder that freedom, whether of thought or of love, withers when vitality ebbs. Historians would later regard Aurora as a paradox. It had pioneered longevity, perfected estates, refined positronic research, and built harbors capable of supporting fleets. At its heart, the city of Eos, once the beacon of spacer authority, alive with councils, archives, and robotic institutes, stood as both symbol and witness. In its gleaming halls, debates that once shaped the galaxy dwindled into echoes, the silence of streets mirroring the stillness of the estates. Even the openness that had once defined Auroran companionship faded into solitude, as dwindling numbers left encounters rare and bonds ephemeral. Yet the city, like the planet, never collapsed. It simply endured, immaculate but emptied, a monument preserved by machines long after its human voice had faded. In clinging to permanence, Aurora relinquished its role in the future. Its decline was not failure in the ordinary sense. Its institutions did not collapse. Its people did not vanish in catastrophe. Instead, Aurora receded like a shoreline, submerged by rising tides. The legacy of Dr. Fastolfe and his cautious vision remained more durable than the estates themselves. His insistence on cooperation, on seeing beyond the boundaries of spacer pride, found echoes in later centuries when humanity spread far beyond the dreams of Aurora's councils. In this way, Aurora endured, not as the center it once claimed to be, but as a quiet teacher, reminding all who looked back that survival belongs not to those who preserve most perfectly, but to those who adapt most wisely.